Hey everyone, it's Sherry Vegas, and in this resin tutorial today I'm going to be covering how to put butterflies in resin and also how to prevent their wings from going translucent in resin. So I got sent this lovely message from a follower on Instagram asking about why every time she added butterflies into resin did they go translucent with their wings, and what could she do to prevent this from happening. So first off, a lot of butterfly wings are already sort of partially translucent to begin with, or majority of the wing is. So then when you do add it into resin, they tend to disappear into the resin and it doesn't look as good as what they look like outside of the resin. Another thing that can cause this to happen is if the resin is able to penetrate into the butterfly wing. So if there's a little bit of damage on that butterfly wing, or a lot of butterfly wings under microscopes are actually quite porous, it then allows the resin the ability to sink on in, which then causes the butterfly wing to go translucent. Very similar to if you've ever added a dry flower into resin, and if a petal's been broken, it then allows the resin to penetrate into that petal, which then turns it translucent. So very similar thing to that. So if you do want to add real butterflies into resin and you don't want this from happening, you do need to do a little bit of prepping beforehand of those butterfly wings. So you can see here I've got two butterflies that are the same. One of them is slightly damaged, so I'm going to use that as the sort of test one where I'm going to add it just directly into resin. And then I'm going to do with the other butterfly, I'm going to do the prepping steps, and I'm going to show you the difference between putting a butterfly just directly into resin and then preparing one properly and then encasing it in resin. So for the purpose of this demonstration, I'm just going to be putting these butterflies into coasters. So I've got my coaster mold here and I've mixed up some casting resin. You can use whatever casting resin you'd like. I'm going to be placing that down as we want the butterfly to be in the center of whatever item we cast. So therefore we need to do a minimum of 2 pours. Now this will change depending on how deep or how big the mold is that you want to do. But obviously if we try to do one big pour, because the butterfly is so light, it's just going to end up floating to the top of the surface, which is something that we don't want. So that's why we always, whenever we cast an item into resin, we need to pour at least 1 layer to then place the item in, let that set so that way it gets stuck into that resin, and then pour the next layer on top, and that way the item cannot float up in the resin. So if you do have a really big mold, you might have to do a few pours to completely cover that item, but for this I only need to do 2 layers today. So I've got my first layer down and then I'm placing my butterfly directly into that. I'm going to then let that fully set and come back and add my second layer in. So just note that these butterflies I'm using are many years old. I found them a very long time ago and I've just kept them in a box because I thought one day they would be useful for some sort of project, and today is that day. So just know that they did die of natural causes. I found them when I was in a park one day and I thought they were really beautiful, and that's why I kept them. But that is also why one of the butterflies is damaged, because it was just out in nature doing its thing, and that happens. So for this next butterfly, I'm going to still do the same things that I did with the resin where I poured the first layer. But before I add the butterfly in, I'm actually going to cut off all of its wings and I'm going to place it in all separately. So with the wings, I'm going to be actually laminating them. By laminating them, I'm going to be completely encasing them in that laminate, and then when they're added into resin, there's no chance of that resin penetrating into the butterfly wings to turn them translucent. And when you add any items that have been laminated in, if you cut nice and close to the edge once it has been laminated, you won't even see it once it is in the clear resin. So this is a really good option to do. Now I've got my laminating machine here and I've cut all my butterfly wings out separately and I'm placing them into my laminating sheet. And then I'm just going to be putting that through really gently through my laminating machine, and then when they come out I'll have perfectly flat butterfly wings. But that's the reason why I did have to cut them off the body, because if I put the body through, it's just going to squish the body and it's not going to look great, or it's not going to look how it's meant to look, because everything will be flat, because obviously when it goes through the laminating machine it's going to squish that on down. But butterfly wings are perfectly fine to add into the laminating machine because they're already nice and thin and flat, just like paper or whatever other item you would necessarily put through a laminator. And then I'm just going to place those into my resin. So my resin has been sitting for a little bit before I've added it on in, so it's gotten a little bit thicker. If you wanted to, and if you were wanting to add it in and keep that sort of 3D shape to your butterfly wing, then you can always use a little bit of UV resin to kind of add it back on into the body, and that way it would have its 3D shape again. But because I am wanting it to stay nice and flat, I'm just going to be placing each of the wings in and then placing the body on top, just making sure that it looks nice and accurate. And then once that sets, I can then pour the next layer of resin over the top. But if you did want to make sure that it still had that sort of 3D nature to it, that it had the wings in a certain position, get a little bit of UV resin and add it all back on like that, so that way you've still got the shape and it's easier to place into the resin and hold its shape. But for this, I just went and placed it directly on in. And these are how the two butterflies look. So the first one actually held up pretty okay in the resin, but that's because these butterflies do have a more opaque colored wing. But you can see a little bit where the resin did make it a bit more translucent than the one that did get laminated. So I hope that has helped everyone when you are encasing a butterfly in resin.